Hello, and welcome to the AB Disruptor Series, where we weigh in on critical topics that are shaping the capital markets. I'm Rick Brink, Senior Vice President and Market Strategist at AllianceBernstein. I knew when we started this series a few years ago that healthcare would be a topic. First, healthcare matters to all of us, but like many things in today's world, it's evolving fairly rapidly with a lot on the horizon, hence the past, present, and future approach. Sadly, I'm not even close to the first person to talk about healthcare using that language. Turns out I was beaten to the punch by about 2.5 millennia. Hippocrates, father of medicine and he of the Hippocratic Oath, was a pretty forward-thinking and very quotable guy when it came to the basics of health. Tell me if this sounds familiar. He spoke to the importance of what we ate, how we slept, our mental state, was big on exercise, including the power of taking walks. Speaking of which, one of my favorite quotes, if you're in a bad mood, go for a walk. If you're still in a bad mood, go for another walk. But to my lack of originality, he also said in medicine that we should declare the past, diagnose the present, and foretell the future. And that is our plan today. And we're going to approach it by looking through the lens of something intuitive to us as patients, the life cycle of patient healthcare, pre-diagnosis, diagnosis, and treatment. And we're going to focus primarily on 3 areas today: genomics, medtech, and the role of AI and accelerated computing in enabling many of these advances. And speaking of we, I am thrilled to have these 3 colleagues joining me to get into this. First, here in New York, next to me is Ed Bryan. And Ed is a senior research analyst covering the global healthcare sector within our Sustainable Thematic Equities team, and a portfolio manager for our Sustainable Global Small Cap portfolio. And next to Ed is Eva Przybylko. Eva is a research analyst focused on healthcare stocks in our global healthcare strategy and in U.S. growth equities. And joining us from London, Wentai Xiao. Wentai is a senior research analyst for thematic innovation equities with a significant history in semiconductors and software. Spoiler alert, Wentai will be figuring prominently in our upcoming disruptors on the supply chain and ecosystem of AI. Hey, Wentai, thanks for being a part of this.
Thanks, Rick.
Okay, I'm going to kick it off by handling the easy part and declaring the past. Now, to create this, I had a chat with ChatGPT, and this is what she told me about the past of pre-diagnosis. Okay, here it goes. First, in one word, it was reactive. Pre-diagnosis largely focused on symptom-based screenings. Preventative care was limited to broad, generalized guidelines like routine physical exams, having a flashback to middle school, not good, to routine physical exams and basic blood tests. Risk factors were poorly understood, often addressed only after disease onset with the impact of limited ability to intervene early. Diseases were often detected at advanced stages. Now, I want you to file that away now as we make our way into pre-diagnosis through these lenses. And we're going to begin with genomics. And if you're going to begin with genomics, you have no choice but to begin first with the Human Genome Project, which kicked off in 1990, moved through to 2003. I believe we started by sequencing influenza, then E. coli, then a ringworm, then a rat, then us. $3 billion and 13 years later, we had gotten our first genome. And so the first question that we should probably hit on, and I'll take a quick swing at it, is what is it exactly at a high level that we get out of this? And the answer is, it's basically our blueprint of who we are. At a high level, it's our eye color, it's our hair color, it's all of that, and it's also predispositions that we might have inside, that we might get based on environment and what we encounter. But if it stayed at $3 billion and 13 years, we would not be talking about it today. Fortunately, as it turns out, today, it takes just hours to do this and for a couple of $100. The question is, how did we make that rapid, almost like a hyper Moore's law reduction down to price? And of course, it comes down to technology, but it's 2 key things. The first of which I always think about transistors, Ed. Same idea here.
Okay, yes, Rick. So the way that reading DNA actually works, right? If you go into one of these molecular biology labs, what you'll see are these boxes, right? So the boxes range in size from a printer to a refrigerator. Think of it that way, right? And you put a sample in, so saliva or blood, and you have a machine, essentially think about it as robotics, that takes the sample and calls out the base pairs of your gene. So the A, C, T's, and G's of your genome, right? There's about 3 billion base pairs. And the cost of using these instruments, right? The instruments have evolved from a technology perspective to do this much cheaper and faster, right? So as you said, the Human Genome Project was billions of dollars. It started 20 years ago. It was hundreds of millions of dollars in these automated machines, right? The Human Genome Project was a whole bunch of people doing this very manually. And so the instruments lowered the cost from hundreds of millions of dollars to hundreds of dollars. And importantly, from 10 years down to several weeks, down to days, and now hours. And the reason that this is so important is because the amount of information you can extract from one genome is interesting and somewhat useful, but the big value is being able to compare multiple genomes. So your genome versus my genome versus Eva's genome, to understand what those differences in base pairs mean when it comes to appearance, health outcomes. And so using the same amount of money, you could sequence vastly more genomes. And so if you look at the amount of genomes that are sequenced every year today versus 20 years ago, it's orders of magnitude more. And so this has enabled us to researchers to extract more information because you can compare more genomes. And again, going back to the 3 billion base pair, this has created a huge data problem. And so it's a great thing that we now have a lot more technology to analyze data coming off of these instruments.
And to bring this home, if you were to just take it out of one cell and stretch it all out, that's about 2 meters long. If you were going to take the entire code and put it into books, it would be 170 books that would take you 95 years to read. Like that kind of big. And now we're trying to compare all of them and put them all together. And so that brings us to our second piece of tech. And I look across the pond, at least in my mind, to Wentai and tell us about AI and accelerated computing in this case and how critical it is to this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to Ed's point, the reason that accelerated computing and the adoption of GPUs has been so impactful is because in the data processing phase of this, right, we're basically taking these modern sequencers, which generate enormous amounts of raw data, but they're generating a lot of this data in the form of images or electrical signals that then have to be converted into nucleotide sequences. And GPUs are a type of chip with thousands and thousands of parallel processing cores. And that's what makes GPUs ideal for the highly parallel task of processing all of these signals. And so by applying GPUs to this task, we can actually vastly accelerate the time from data acquisition to sequence generation from, many, many hours or days, to even minutes for each of the sort of discrete steps. And the second area that it has a lot of impact on is on alignment. So once the raw sequences or reads are produced, they have to be aligned to a reference genome. And that's a process that could involve comparing millions or billions of short sequences simultaneously. And again, because you have this GPU parallel processing architecture, what they can do is they can accelerate these alignment algorithms to perform all of these comparisons concurrently. Third, to Ed's point, there's no purpose in actually generating all of this data unless we can do something with it, right? So we want to be able to identify genetic variants and insertions and deletions. We want to be able to apply advanced machine learning for tasks like pattern recognition, functional annotation, predictive modeling. And GPUs are very good at handling that, right? Because GPUs are inherently good at supporting large-scale matrix computations and neural network operations. And that's what makes them ideal for running all of these complex statistical models and machine learning frameworks against a huge store of genomic data.
Thank you very much. So hopefully you grasp the scale of just how much is being computed. And again, we're trying to look across a lot of things to draw things out. And so Eva, I'm going to start with you here because I think there are probably 3 big questions in genomic for me as I listen and chat with all of you. And the first of which is, okay, we've sequenced it. What is it from a health perspective now that we've been doing this and crunching the numbers? What are the things that we're able to extract that matters for healthcare?
Right. So there's a lot that we've learned about the genome over the past few decades, and specifically about which genes have an influence on disease and manifestations of that within our body. So we know that there are around 20 to 25,000 genes in a human genome. And we have been able to, over time, link certain genes to specific diseases so that by knowing your genetic sequence, you have the ability to know which diseases you may be predisposed to throughout your life. So there are some diseases that we have linked to single genes, right? Things like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease. So that if you sequence a genome and you notice a mutation within that gene, that is kind of indicative of having that disease. But there are also more complex diseases out there that involve not only multiple genes, but also environmental and lifestyle factors. And so we're still over time learning more about the linkages between our genetics and specific genes and our predisposition to disease over time. So that is one area where where analyzing a genome and developing a better understanding of genetics can really, alter the trajectory of how early we identify a disease, but also are able to treat it and intervene, which is important. Another interesting area that applies to healthcare is in the space of pharmaceuticals. We're able to determine from genetic information how you may respond to certain drugs within the body, right? So for things like blood thinners, for example, certain people may be more sensitive to them or metabolize them in different ways. And that can alert your doctor to either choose a drug that is more suitable for your body and for your, genetic type, or alter the dosage, which leads to better safety and outcomes over time.
Right. Thank you. So let's put this practically. Nowadays, how is genomics showing up in sort of the beginnings of pre-diagnosis and screening in the world at large?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to go back to the cost here, right? So the cost of reading a genome, hundreds of millions of dollars to hundreds of dollars, right? And that cost decline has happened faster than Moore's law, right? So the cost of computing, this has happened. Genomics is happening faster, and behaviorally, people tend to underestimate exponential trends, right? So we tend to underestimate all of these markets that spring up from cheap computing, right? Things like Netflix, social media. As the price of computing has gone down, people had a small market opportunity for desktop computers, and now we have, supercomputers in our pocket, right? Because it's just so cheap. And so as we've gone from very expensive genomics, this was something that was only done in very high-end research labs, right, in universities. And as the cost got cheaper, you started to open up, with the aid of all these discoveries, new markets, right? And some of the first places where this really had an impact was in diagnostics, right, and screening. So one of the first large clinical markets of genomics was non-invasive prenatal testing. Right. So the existing standard of care for screening for chromosomal abnormalities in the fetus was doing an amniocentesis, right? A very invasive draw from the uterus of a pregnant mother. And what they discovered, because they were able to do very, very cheap DNA sequencing, is that you could detect fetal DNA in the mother's bloodstream. Right. So now what you can do is you can take a blood draw from the mother and test for diseases that impact the baby. And so we've seen rapid adoption of these types of data as a screening tool. And what was so fascinating once this was more widely used is the labs that were processing these samples kept finding odd results. Okay. And what they discovered is that they could detect issues with the mother using this DNA sequencing. So they were finding instances where the mother had cancer. And so now researchers are developing blood-based tools to screen for cancer, to replace things like mammogram, colonoscopy, things that you're going after very specific cancers with kind of rudimentary screening tools. And now you can use simple blood draw to extract cancerous DNA and analyze it. So as the costs have come down, you start to open up these big potential opportunities around screening, particularly in the pre-diagnosis stage.
So these are, the whole idea of, you can get jabbed in the stomach or we can, take a blood draw. There's lots of these. Actually, I can't help but bring up when we were talking about colonoscopies versus other ways to detect. And you told me a story about Japan that sticks with me. So there was a different technology available at the time where you could swallow a pill, camera go down and take some pictures. But what you should know is in Japan, when you go for your colonoscopy, for men that are avoidant of it as it is, imagine if you couldn't get anesthesia when you went to get this done, and you still had to go for your colonoscopy. You would imagine...
I'll take the pill cam.
The pill cam is probably great, but we also have another one nowadays. It's and if you want to chat with that about
that. Sure. So look, anybody who watches sports now sees tons of ads for this thing called Cologuard, right? Which essentially is you send a stool sample in, and again, they can process it and extract the DNA from your stool in order to test for colon cancer. And I think this kind of brings up a interesting point, which is the companies that supply the solutions to help run this process, because it's essentially what you're doing is you're automating a very manual process, right? You can't just spit into a DNA sequencer and get the results out, right? And so imagine if you were a molecular biologist, a PhD working in a lab, and you're getting millions of stool samples into your lab. Wouldn't you want to have a robot do that, right? And so these are solutions to help automate the whole process. And those types of companies are seeing a lot of growth here because the advent of these tests.
And for this reason, there's this developing trend of newborns getting genetic sequencing because of all the things you can tell right out of the gate. Now, I want to stay with pre-diagnosis, but I want to make my way into medtech now. So Eva, can we first start with just broad wearables?
Right. So wearables are becoming increasingly part of overall health management for consumers and for doctors. So we have a lot of consumer technology companies, such as Apple, moving into developing wearable technology that we're all very familiar with today. For example, the Apple Watch, which is able to continuously capture our own health data on factors like exercise or our heart rhythms even. And we're able to have real-time access and insight into what that looks like for us. And so that is kind of creating an additional data point that's becoming part of our overall health record. That's going to help us figure out how, lifestyle management and lifestyle factors play into overall disease prevention, but as well as progression.
And you had a kind of a real world example that you shared with me as it relates to Apple.
Right. So the Apple Watch now has a feature where it's able to pretty accurately detect atrial fibrillation. And I did have a family member who had no prior history of AFib, who got an alert from his Apple Watch that he was in a state of AFib that went on for a couple of hours. Because of that alert, he was able to get in touch with his doctors and quickly return his heart back to a normal rhythm with medicine. So it was great that he was able to kind of catch that early and address it that same day.
And again, just as we were talking about on the genomic side, we have a cost reduction here. We have accessibility. We have I don't want to say full miniaturization, but things getting smaller and easier to use and access.
Yeah, I mean, and it's no wonder you're reaching price points now where consumers can just buy it themselves, right? So for example, with the Apple Watch, the Fitbit, I mean, back to genomics, I did 23andMe, right, when the price of sequencing got cheap enough. And so this is really enabling interactions with the healthcare system that don't involve the annual visit to your doctor, right? And so not surprisingly, people get sick and have illness in between visits to their doctor every year, right? And so this is a great tool, and it's no wonder you're seeing rapid uptake as the cost continues to decline. So I think the sensors are just going to continue to get cheaper and better across a bunch of different diseases beyond AFib and 23andMe.
And I would say that in going through this process, talking with a lot of folks, the takeaway here is know what you have access to yourself and pay attention to it. This came out of a lot of my conversations. There's more data being provided for you that you have access to in your watch, in your phone. Make sure to pay attention to that information. It is valuable, as Eva pointed out. So from a medical perspective, anything else on the wearables that we want to speak to that would come from that side?
I mean, look, these throw off a lot of data, right? And what's interesting nowadays, which wasn't the case 20 years ago, at least in the United States, is you would go into your doctor's office and your health record was in a manila folder, right? There wasn't any data. It was the data, it was printed out on a piece of paper, right? And so the fact that we have all the data coming off these sensors, the fact that there's so much more health data now being recorded, nowadays when you go to your doctor's office, hopefully there's a electronic medical record for you. Now this has provided researchers, doctors, a lot more information to use alongside obviously advances in data analytics to help make sense of all the data.
Thank you. I want to segue now from pre-diagnosis into diagnosis. So can we go back to genomics and talk about the role of genomics in diagnosis? Ed, do you want to take a shot at that one?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple different applications where genomics is being used today, right? Very clearly. And I think one that is very tangible and visceral for a lot of people, myself included, is COVID. Right. So genomics, if you're able to, as you said, one of the first genomes that was sequenced was E. coli. Right. So what you can use with genomics is to get the exact genome of a virus or a pathogen or bacteria. OK, and you can use that information to develop a very targeted diagnostic test. So this has been used to develop cheap and fast tests for things like hospital-acquired infections, where you want to know right away how serious is the infection. And because the technology is getting cheaper and easier to use, this has gone from very specialized labs to hospitals to bedside. I mean, now when you go to the doctor, I went to a CVS Minute Clinic and they had a test there for a molecular diagnostic test. So that's been one area where you've seen a lot of adoption of what we call molecular diagnostic tests. Another area has been in cancer, where traditionally cancer was denoted or diagnosed based on where it is in your body. Okay, lung cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer. okay? And because we can actually sequence and determine what's driving the actual tumor growth, right? Cancer is inherently a genetic disease, right? It's based on your DNA gone haywire, which causes just uninterrupted cell growth, okay? And now you can say, okay, what is the mutation that is driving the tumor? And so no longer it's, okay, where's the actual tumor, but is this a HER2 mutation? Is this an EGFR mutation, ALK mutation? And so you can develop these much more targeted tests to determine what's causing it, and that helps lead to a better course of treatment.
For me and anybody else, the last three things you were talking about, what does that sort of mean, those different types of breakdowns? The ALK test, what does that mean basically?
Yeah, so this helps direct the treatment toward a specific drug, right? So increasingly what we're seeing, and now we're kind of getting to the whole treatment area, is drug companies are developing treatments that go after a specific driver mutation, right? So instead of saying, okay, here's a drug for lung cancer and it might be moderately effective. I mean, the sort of unfortunate reality is many drugs are simply not effective, right, for a lot of diseases because they've been tested in these very generalized patient populations, right? So now what you're finding is if you take, like, how does the drug actually work, right? It's going after this specific mutation. And so now you have tests. So one of the first examples of this was in leukemia. So there was a drug that was developed based on a specific genetic mutation, BCR-ABL. And if you took this drug, it was a pill, you were effectively cured, right, as long as you kept taking the pill. And so we're seeing a lot more examples of these. They're called targeted medicines come up, and where you're linking a diagnostic to a specific drug.
Thank you. And we've got more coming on the treatment side. Before we make our way there, I want to talk about medical imaging from a diagnosis perspective, if we could.
Right. So medical imaging, so think MRIs, CT scans, ultrasounds, that's been around for a while, but AI is actually having a huge influence on this field of medicine and enabling radiologists to be able to identify abnormalities on these images with greater speed and sometimes even greater accuracy. So we have seen models being developed by healthcare companies as well as large technology companies that you're all familiar with, such as Google. And they're able to build these models that can, that have been trained on thousands, tens of thousands of images and can potentially identify an issue at a much earlier stage in the disease. And really, early detection and early intervention is the key to successful outcomes in a lot of cases.
While we're on radiology, I want to also talk about the radiopharmaceuticals while we're here, because for cancer, that's another really interesting one.
I think it fits into this theme that we're seeing in healthcare, which is to make medicine more precise, right? And so with the radiopharmaceuticals, companies are developed specific diagnostic agents that are engineered to bind to specific cancerous tissues within the body, for example, for prostate cancer. And that is injected into the body and it shows up with much greater clarity on a scan, such as a PET scan. So it's able to provide a kind of clearer, more accurate picture of where the disease is within the body to be able to target it more effectively.
Okay, so we've talked pre-diagnosis, we've talked diagnosis, now we make our way to treatment. And let's go back to genomics. So the second big question that I took away from all the conversations, once it's what is the genome telling us or what are we learning, is can we translate that into a medical approach? Mm-hmm. So where are we at?
Yeah, so genomics, as we talked about, right, as the cost came down, you start off in a research lab, then you had these diagnostic tests that came out several years. I mean, it takes you a couple of years to develop a diagnostic test. The area where we're seeing an impact nowadays is in the area of new drug development, right? So on average, it takes about 20 years to develop a new medicine, right? And so the earliest discoveries of genomics that were happening 20 years ago, when it was still extremely expensive to sequence a genome, those are now being launched as new medicines today, right? So one of the most recent drugs that has been launched in the market is a drug to treat Alzheimer's. That is based on a discovery that was made roughly 20 years ago, where researchers were sequencing a family in Northern Europe that had a very rare form, a very aggressive form of Alzheimer's, okay? And so as the cost of sequencing has declined over time, right, what we're seeing is a wave of new treatments that are helping address all of these mutations and changes and differences in genomes that we've been discovering. And so you've seen all of these biotech pipelines really fill up with a lot of exciting new drugs that can go after the genetic basis of disease. And this has really been changing the way that drugs are discovered, which used to be based on huge screenings. So you go and you take a sample of dirt and you see if any of the microbes there address disease. Now it's much more targeted approach to developing more effective treatments.
So I don't want this to be lost, is the idea that as costs have come down, the pipeline of 20-year forward drugs just keeps getting fatter and fatter and fatter.
Yes, and better, one would argue too, right? Because you're really going after the underlying driver of some of these diseases.
And I don't want to give away the future, but we're getting there next. But this idea of there's generic drugs that are sort of for the masses. Then there's the sort of more targeted, which is where this is also sort of showing up. And as a teaser to get everybody to stick around to the end, we're making our way toward N of 1. Yes. So we're gonna get there. But for now, it's just the massive amount of what, as you've said to me, we can see it. We know it's coming, right? Because there's a 20-year window and we can see the number of things because of the number of tests that we're being able to put out there. And so it's going to take a while, but you can look out and see it's all coming down the road.
Yes.
It's phenomenal, fascinating stuff to me. Staying with medical technology, I love talking robots. Can we talk about robotics in healthcare?
Sure. So robotics is having a huge impact right now in the area of surgery. So we know that sometimes for some patients in certain conditions, surgery is still the best treatment option. And we've been making a lot of advances in how we're able to do surgery in a less invasive way. So robotics, as it stands, is one of the most minimally invasive ways to do a surgery. It requires a much smaller incision and results in a lot less tissue damage. So what that means is that there are shorter recovery times, less complications, and ultimately better outcomes for the patient. When we think about lowering complications and hospitalization rates, that also has positive implications for medical health systems and costs overall. So we're seeing robotics or surgical robots becoming more present in soft tissue surgeries in areas like urology, gynecology, as well as general surgeries.
Which reminds me, not that all of the world's best medical knowledge comes from Instagram, but I saw an incredible video about surgical robotics, and it was through AI, as I think of Wentai. They were working on suturing and stitching, and at some point, one of the hands dropped the needle. And the crazy thing is, it wasn't programmed to do this, but the hand actually reached down and picked up the needle and went back. So I don't know if I feel inspired or terrified by this, but from a robotics perspective, a hand that was supposed to suture also said, "Oh, I dropped the needle. Let me pick this up and keep going." And so robots are fascinating, and it always makes me think: is it going the direction of WALL-E or the Terminator? But at least for right now, the minimally invasive surgery is a huge, huge thing. And it actually makes me think about your amniocentesis example as well. It's what technology across the spectrum allows us to do, which actually reminds me, you have a great way of tying together genomics and medtech as it relates to diabetes. This is one where you can bring all these things to bear together.
Right. So the field of diabetes treatment has evolved a lot over the last few decades and has gotten a lot more user-friendly in a way that puts patients in control of their health. So for patients that are dependent on insulin, as is the case with type 1 diabetes, the historical kind of standard of care was to check your blood glucose levels manually throughout the day using finger pricks. Then that would determine how much insulin you need at any given time, and you would inject that insulin to lower your glucose levels. So quite manual, required a lot of touch points throughout the day. With medtech and advances there, we've been able to make that process a little bit easier and more seamless. So we now have wearables for continuous glucose monitoring that you can wear for a couple of weeks at a time. They're very small, and they can actually monitor your glucose levels and transmit that data to a smartphone in real time continuously. So there's no more need for finger pricks throughout the day. Then on the other side, there are wearables that store insulin and are able to actually deliver insulin into the body throughout the day based on the readings that they're getting from the blood glucose monitor. So we've created this kind of closed loop artificial pancreas, if you will, using AI that just makes it a lot easier to manage this condition.
Fascinating. Wentai, one more thing that I want to make sure that we work in from an accelerated computing perspective is its role in drug discovery, right? We've been talking about creating treatments, but in discovering new drugs beyond genomics, there's a whole field opening up because of accelerated compute.
Yeah, I'm personally very excited about how accelerated compute could transform drug discovery, because my mom actually spent 20 years as a research scientist at Novartis. And if you think about how she did a lot of her experiments, it involved forming a hypothesis and then mixing some chemicals together in like a test tube or a petri dish, and then waiting for something to happen or something to grow, and then making observations, right? And then refuting or refining her hypothesis. And in other words, like all of her experiments were happening in the real physical world, right? And I think in the future, we can run more and more simulations in the computer, or what is called in silico. So instead of assembling the experiment physically and waiting for it to play out in order for my mom to advance a hypothesis, she could, in theory, just run tens of thousands of experiments concurrently in the virtual world. And this should vastly increase the surface area of, hypotheses that scientists like her can test, and really speed up the research process. And if you step out even further into the future, is it possible that someday perhaps the FDA would actually accept simulated drug trials, where the proposed drug is being run against digital twins of human subpopulations? Maybe that's in the very, very long run, but there are some precedents that we can point to. So, for example, in aerospace and in autos, there are standardized simulation results that are accepted by the FAA and by various other regulators for many steps of the certification process. So while you still use some physical tests like crash tests, they're still used to, for final approval of aircraft and cars. We actually rely on those crash tests, with dummies sitting in them and, the airbags exploding on the dummies. We rely on them a lot less than we did in the past. And so, from our standpoint, if the end state really is about vastly expanding the surface area of hypotheses, during discovery, and perhaps shortening the time spent in the drug approval process. Like if you step out 10 years, 20 years, how would that change the industry structure in life sciences? Like, would we see companies that have vast databases of biological data and supercomputing clusters? Would they benefit disproportionately, which might lead to further concentration in the industry? Or is the widespread adoption of this technology, could it actually, lower the barriers to entry and lead to fragmentation? So we think that this is an area that is really exciting and a really exciting application of accelerated compute.
So we're talking about personalized medicine, or we're making our way toward and teasing N of 1. Beyond personalized medicine, as we get back into the accelerated computing, clinical drug trials can be more targeted because of genomics. So maybe just a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. By sequencing patient genomes, researchers could identify the genetic variants and biomarkers in order to find the subpopulations that are more likely, right, to respond to a specific drug. And as we discussed previously, accelerated computing plays a really important role in just increasing the speed and bringing down the costs of this kind of genomic analysis. So accelerated computing could also be applied in this way to actually make clinical trials a lot more targeted and a lot more efficient in the future.
Thanks, Wata. And that's what I know we're sort of getting to is there's the mass treatment, and there's this in-between step before we get into the N of 1, which is you can find that one more thing that reduces the group. Right. And then it can become more effective in terms of treatment. And that's obviously a huge part of this whole process, is making our way toward more effective medicines. Ed mentioned this. The closer we get to this, the more efficient, the more effective we know that it's going to be. This leads me to the third question of genomics. And this sounds almost sci-fi, but we've talked about what can we learn from the gene? Can we create medicines that are based upon that information? The third question is, can we just change the gene itself? And there's actually real world applications that are present, because the answer right now is there's some yes there.
Yes, definitely. It's fascinating developments that we've been observing. I mentioned earlier that there are certain diseases that we've been able to link to specific genes within the body. And when we have a deep understanding of that gene, we can specifically pinpoint the mutations that are leading to disease. And we now have the ability to actually go into that gene and edit it to look the way that it should and effectively cure the disease. And so there is a company called CRISPR, a technology that is enabling us to actually directly edit the genome. And a company called Vertex Pharmaceuticals recently, in partnership with CRISPR and their technology, developed a treatment for sickle cell disease, where they're directly editing the patient's own genes, putting them back into the body, and it's serving as a functional cure for sickle cell disease. And that therapy has already been approved about a year ago. So it's on market today.
That's extraordinary. And it makes me think of, Star Trek future. So with that in mind, I'm going to transition into the future here. So, this is the exciting part. I mean, the present is incredible.
Yeah.
But these conversations about what might be coming and are on the horizon are pretty remarkable. So I'm just going to pose a general question. The future of genomics and what we're going to get out of it 5 years, 10 years from now, et cetera. Where do we think we find ourselves?
Yes, maybe I'll start. So firstly, in diagnosis, right? I mean, because I tend to think about, okay, what is possible as the price of genomics, the price of sequencing DNA continues to decline, right? I mean, as we look forward 5 years, it's going to be even cheaper, $10, $1, a cent, right? And so what is possible when sequencing becomes even cheaper, even easier, even faster? Okay. And some of the areas that we're seeing researchers latch onto now and start to do in labs, one area is around single cell. Right. So kind of going back to cancer, we're finding is when you take a tumor, it's not just one homogeneous type of cells that's driving the cancer. It's actually a lot of different types of cells. And if you give a targeted treatment, sometimes it only addresses one cell type when there might be another cell that's actually driving the cancer growth. And so that's one area where if you could sequence ever more cheaply, instead of sequencing the average DNA of a tumor, you can sequence all the cells. Okay. Another area where individual cells is very important is the microbiome. You have in your body about 10 trillion cells, right? Which sounds like a lot. There's 100 trillion microbes that live in your body. Okay. And a lot of them live in your gut. And what researchers are discovering is that this whole environment, the whole makeup of the microbes has a huge impact on your health, right? And being able to actually sequence cheaply individual cells in your microbiome, we're learning, all sorts of ways that this impacts health. So that's kind of on the diagnostics side. You also see the cascade of genomics goes into RNA, which gets translated into proteins. That's kind of like the molecular biology kind of 101. If you can actually just pinpoint which protein is wrong because of the genomics, what we're finding is that's actually a very effective way to get after some of these diseases, right? The metaphor that I would use is if you had a broken stair in your house, right? A carpenter comes in to fix it. They don't look at the blueprint. They just go fix the stair, right? So using proteins analysis as a way to address disease is something that we're seeing a lot of interest in. So that's on the diagnostic side. On the treatment side, I think there's a lot of different ways that what we think of as medicine is changing dramatically. Okay. So people think of medicine as a pill or an injection, right? Now, because of COVID, we're sort of familiar with mRNA vaccines, right? Where you essentially developed a agent genetically altered your immune system to fight infection, which was COVID. Okay. What pharmaceutical companies are doing, and this isn't science fiction, this is in clinical trials now, is taking the genetic makeup of a tumor and designing a specific vaccine to go after that specific cancer. Okay. So kind of recoding your immune system using vaccines. The next step, and this leverages the CRISPR technology, is you can extract immune cells from your body, and then you can use CRISPR on those immune cells, re-inject them back into your body, and then your immune system, you have essentially a new immune system, which can target cancer. And that's not science fiction, that's on the market now, and is a very effective treatment for cancer. So these are some of the sort of N01 treatments that you were kind of alluding to and teasing up.
Okay, so now we are on to investment implications. So I would like you to take the sort of patient angle and turn it on to the investor side. And I'd just like to ask you how you dimension everything we've been talking about, how you think about it from an investor's perspective. Let's start with genomics side.
Yeah, sure. So the way that we think about this is there's a gold rush happening with all of the genomic information that's being created nowadays with cheap DNA sequencing. And we're investing in the picks and shovels. Right. So all the gold miners that are coming to San Francisco to mine gold, we're selling them their Levi's jeans, and their pickaxes, right? And some of the specific categories within that, if you go to research labs, right, this is where a lot of the DNA sequencing is happening. Illumina is the leading vendor, which we talked about, but there are other companies that are developing DNA sequencing and all of the tools and steps that go around that process, right? The amount of sequencing activity is rising and growing very rapidly, right, as the cost is coming down. And in the standpoint of drug development, right, it's taking all those discoveries and understanding how that change, these mutations in DNA, actually leads to disease. So understanding, okay, here's the change in the genome, here are all the biological processes that ends up in a disease. And so you have technologies like very, very fine imaging, so nuclear magnetic resonance, mass spectrometry. There's a lot of these technologies that are happening in research labs where you're seeing a lot of funding and a lot of interest. And going back to the topic of AI, right? AI needs a lot of data in order to crunch this and gain insights. And so a lot of the labs you need to generate these insights to understand biology. So we're seeing a lot of activity there. On the diagnostic side, and diagnostics in a way is also robotics in healthcare, right? It's these boxes that automate a lot of manual processes. So in these cases, running tests. So let's say you go to the doctor, you are sick, the doctor will send that to a lab who will run this in a box and get a result. And so there's leading vendors here who are taking the genomic insights and launching tests that can then be used to treat patients. And all these genetic insights are leading to a lot of new tests, right? COVID was one example, but cancer we talked about. So we're seeing a lot of growth in that market as well. And then on the drug side, companies that enable clinical trials, right? So at the end of the day, if you make a discovery, you have to see if it's effective. And so you want to run a clinical trial to test that in patients. And there are niche companies that are experts at designing and running these trials, which are very important to the future of biotech and pharma companies. And drugs, as we talked about, we're getting more and more complex. You go from making pills, very simple, to injectable, liquids, to these cell-based therapies, CRISPR, right? These are very, very complex molecules. And so there's very, very specialized companies that are involved in what we call bioproduction, or actually making drugs. And so those companies are benefiting from a lot of the activity in the pipelines that we're seeing across the biotechnology industry.
Thanks, sir. And Eva, did you want to add anything on the genomics side?
Sure. As we speak to some of the largest pharmaceutical and biotech companies out there, we see that they are investing in continuing to build out their own in-house genomic capabilities and databases. And they're increasingly tying that with AI to see what information they can glean from their databases and how they can use this to, create new drugs that will be more precise, efficacious, and safe for humans in the future. So it's something that we see as a developing area and that we're watching very closely.
Thank you, Eva. And I want to stay with you. And now let's move on to medtech and investment implications there.
Right. So over the past few years, we've all seen a lot of value accrue to traditional technology companies that are operating in the AI ecosystem or enabling AI technologies. We think that this has not been appreciated yet in healthcare. So we see companies today that are integrating AI into their products, such as, for example, in radiology and diagnostics. And we see room for that to continue to improve and evolve over time. And we don't think that the stocks are necessarily reflecting that value that they can provide. So we're very focused on understanding the ways in which AI is not only currently affecting healthcare, but the potential that it has in the future, and trying to, figure out the companies that will accrue the most value from these investments.
Thank you.
Yeah, so from a medtech perspective, one of the trends that we've been talking about is this whole concept of miniaturization, right? And in the past, right, medical devices, you think about it as carpentry or plumbing, right? You had saws and various basic tools in order to go in and do surgery. Now, as sensors are becoming smaller, as a lot of the devices are becoming much smaller, you have the less invasive procedures that you're able to do. So this is opening up vast new markets to treat diseases in a less invasive way that just weren't possible before. So this is fueling a lot of growth for medical device companies. So for instance, heart surgery is a great example. In the past, if you had a heart abnormality, you had to undergo open heart surgery. And now with the more sophisticated devices you have nowadays, you can go in with a catheter in a vein, to reach your heart and implant, let's say, a new valve. And so this is opening up markets to treat patients, that might have been too old or frail to have open heart surgery in the past. And so all the ways that you can access different body parts with these advanced imaging technologies, with these advanced catheters to go into the body and make changes, install sensors, new body parts. Really, this is something that we could talk about in the context of genomics, is the whole topic of regenerative medicine. That's kind of a future. But being able to do these types of procedures is really fueling a lot of growth for companies that are enabling these technologies.
Thank you, Ed. Wentai, okay, you're up again. We've been talking about investment implications, but a big part of this, when we're talking about as much technology and AI and everything is taking place, is potential disruption. So one of the spaces you speak to is robotics. So let's talk about robotics and potential disruption in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one paradigm shift that we're closely monitoring is robotics, and not just, the medical and surgical robotics that Eva spoke about earlier, but, first and foremost, general purpose industrial robots. Because in the past, a lot of industrial robots, they had to be programmed with very specific instructions. So to pick up a glass of water, for example, the robot had to be given, the position of the glass and how much force it has to apply to pick it up without actually breaking it. And what's underway right now across industrial robotics is really the production of industry vertical synthetic data, which is data obtained from simulations of, for example, a production process on a factory floor, right? So if you think about like how ChatGPT could be trained on all of us talking on the internet, right? How do you train an actual robot? Well, you actually need, you can't just go and scrape the internet, right? For that kind of physical synthetic data about a production process. So this kind of synthetic data, which we'll get from running, billions of simulations on factory floors, that synthetic data will be used to train physical AIs, which are robots that are capable of understanding physics. So in other words, the robot of the future, we won't need to give it as specific of instructions. It can be told, bring me a glass of water, right? And because it actually has been trained on understanding the physics of glass, the physics of water, it will know how much force to exercise to actually transport it without shattering it. And so we think that there is a compelling investment case for the enablers of these next generation robots. And that includes, the actuators or the receptors, these different components that go into robot limbs to improve precision, smoothness, the torque and the force of robot motions, as well as the computing and the software companies that are enabling the running of virtual environments that we need in order to train physical AI models. And on the other hand, who could be disrupted? Well, prior generation robotics companies, right? Or people that specialized in customizing and adding value by writing very specific, task-specific software to commoditized robot parts. Those cohort of companies could actually be disrupted as we move into this next generation of physical AIs.
Thank you. When you say that, I go back to my robotic hand and, instead of bring me a glass of water, I know to pick up the needle. I want to ask about the AI side of disruption, because AI itself, sometimes we forget this is maybe not the end of the road on AI. And I'm thinking of Instagram again and the Willow chip. So how could AI be disrupted just of its own volition?
Yeah, it's definitely possible, because if you think about what we're doing in AI, we're basically mathematically representing, human speech, human language, images, and the physical world. We're mathematically representing those things so that then we can go and apply computations against those mathematical representations. But in order to do anything, right, first we have to mathematically represent. We have to turn everything into numbers and then store those numbers in a kind of matrix format. And if you think about it, the current class of artificial intelligence right now is being dominated by large language models, by LLMs. And these LLMs are really using a type of mathematics to represent the world, which is linear algebra. And linear algebra obviously is trained and inferenced by solving out these gigantic matrix multiplications, right? So when you hear that a certain model like ChatGPT or GPT-4 or DeepSeek, that these are hundreds of billions of parameters. Really, this is what we're talking about, is the size of the actual matrices, the parameters in the matrices that are being trained and then are being multiplied out in the actual inferencing process. And so if you, again, zoom out, look out 10 years, is it possible that there's limitations to what can be represented with linear algebra? Is it possible that there's a whole world, a physical world or a biological world or other things that actually lend themselves to being represented in a different mathematical way? What if there's some things that can only be represented in these very complex partial differential equations? And so just as we have a set of computing architecture that happens to be very, very good at matrix multiplication, at linear algebra, maybe in 20 years or so, we'll have a different architecture for AI, and maybe it will be quantum computers that are going and training and inferencing and solving out a very different mathematical representation of the world. So maybe if you think about it, it's like currently we have GPUs, ASICs, CPUs, right, doing linear algebra. That's the current form of AI. And maybe in 20 years, it'll be like quantum computers that are doing partial differential equations. And that will be like the next generation of AI. And it could be that these two ecosystems coexist because some, a bunch of things like speech and video and so forth is really well represented in matrix sort of format. And we'll have, other workloads and other problems and tasks that will be done on quantum computers. They could coexist. They could also be disruptive to one another.
It's funny, so much interesting information there, but at the end I caught maybe these ecosystems could coexist and the matrix. Those were the two things I think I took away. But and I apologize for the math on this particular call, but again, there's so many changes afoot. AI is and accelerated computing is what's enabling a lot of this. But we forget there's going to be a 2.0 and a 3.0 or whatever it is that comes to follow there, and there's potential disruption. Thank you, Wentai.
Thank you.
And with that, we've come to the end of our comments today. With a final quick observation, if you'll indulge me. There's no shortage of headlines on healthcare today with concerns about different healthcare systems and insurance, the politics of healthcare, but underlying most of it is costs and resources. Unfortunately, you could argue that there is a nearly unlimited amount of potential healthcare needs, but not unlimited spend, and it's been exacerbated by a kind of paradox of health. Today, we're living longer, but at the same time with a higher incidence of diseases, and moreover, they're increasingly more chronic versus acute, meaning continuing care needs. I think a large part of the potential solution lies in our discussion today. If tomorrow's healthcare includes an earlier understanding of health risks, a way to attend to them earlier, faster and more accurate diagnoses, and more effective and often targeted solutions the first time, then a very beneficial, if dispassionate financial thing occurs. The net present value of healthcare over the patient lifecycle declines meaningfully. And my hope is that it helps to balance the books, as it were. Net, as patients, we win. A big thank you to Ed and Eva and Wentai for their time and expertise today and all this information. I find it very, very valuable. And of course, as always, thanks to all of you for joining and your continued support of the Disruptor Series. Next up will be the Capital Markets Outlook in early April, and I hope to see you then. Thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please email us at disruptor@AllianceBernstein.com. And join us next quarter for another episode of the Disruptor Series by AllianceBernstein.